Right, good morning, welcome back. Now today, motorcycle rear wheel bearings. Now this setup is pretty much the same for any Japanese motorcycle. You have 3 bearings in the rear wheel, 1 in the sprocket carrier and 2 in the wheel itself. Now you don't need to be shown how to get a wheel out of a motorcycle or how to put it back in again. So we'll focus the video on just changing the bearings themselves. Let's go. Right, there we are, ready to go. Now quickly, 2 things about the parts washer. First of all, the fluid in there does not need changing. It is black, you can see that from looking in there, but that is actually some of the fluid I just drew off. What you see when you look in there is the sediment in the bottom, and you just let it settle, and eventually I'll clean that out in the future. But that fluid has got a long life yet still, it doesn't need to be thrown away. So the other thing, very important, if you're going to take parts like this and immerse them in a cleaning tank, remember that the cleaning degreaser is going to get into that sealed bearing inside there, which is great because my bearing's going in the bin, it doesn't matter, I'm going to put a fresh one in there. But if you're not, if you just want to clean this up, please don't drop it in your parts washer because that cleaning fluid will melt the grease inside the bearing with the obvious results in the future. The bearing will just break up once it gets water inside it. So do make sure, never put bearings you intend to continue using in a parts washer. But I'm sure you knew that. Anyway, let's get started. All right, now with any Japanese motorcycle, pretty much they have the same setup. There's 3 wheel bearings across the back. You've got 2 in the wheel casting itself, 1 either side, and 1 in the sprocket carrier, usually the biggest one. So as that makes it look like a game of 2 halves, let's make a start with the carrier first. Right, now with these carriers, the first thing to remove is this rubber seal on the outside that keeps the weather out. And it's not an interference fit that needs a press or a bearing puller. It's just kind of a thumb press fit. So that comes out carefully with a screwdriver. Right, the next thing is a little spacer tube to remove that's in there. They're fitted from the inside, so you tap them out from the outside. On some bikes, they literally fall out, so just make sure you remember which way they're orientated for reinstallation afterwards. But this one, it's a little bit snug. It's not actually an interference fit like the bearing itself, but I will need to tap that out. And if you're going to do that with yours, be a little bit careful because you will need to reuse it. All right, got my new wheel bearing ready, and I checked the old one, and something's immediately reminded me that's important to say. There's a couple of nicks and kink marks here in the seal. The seal on these old bearings has been lifted off and snapped back on, probably because it's been repacked, and there's an important thing. You mustn't take the seal off your brand new bearing and think it's the right thing to pack a load more grease in, because they only have a small amount of grease in them, which is correct from the manufacturer. They're sealed. Leave them alone and just fit them. Apparently the consequences are, so I read, that if you pack them solid with grease, the ball bearings, they don't roll properly. What they do instead is skid, because they're jammed up with grease, and as they skid, that's friction, they get hot. As they get hot, they expand and they jam up, and it can collapse the bearing. So it's very important, you mustn't put more grease into these sealed bearings. The manufacturers know how much should be in there, that's why they put seals on them. Leave them alone, just fit them. Right, and I said at the beginning of this video series and the introduction video that I want to make all these videos as simple as possible for stuff you can do at home, right back to the roots of our channel at the beginning, 14 years ago. Just straightforward stuff, no need for special tools. So far I've used a 20-ton press and a blind bearing puller or a bridge puller. They're both fancy tools you might not have, but I bet you've got a screwdriver and I bet you've got a little hammer, and you don't need any more than that to take wheel bearings out. Seriously, that's how I always used to do it before I invested in stuff like this. So the first thing is warm up the casting to expand it a little bit out of the way to make a little bit of a less grip on the bearing because they are pressed in. Inside there's a little tube. Push the tube out of the way with your finger. It should move. If it doesn't, use a screwdriver. Just lever it. There it is. It moves out of the way. And that exposes the edge of the bearing. You can feel the lip now. And then as soon as you've got a little bit of heat into that, it expands it away. It loosens the grip on the bearing. Spin it over and just from the other side, just tap it out. And that will tap out all the way. And then the spacer will drop out, and then you can tap the other one out with the spacer itself. Right, now out of the two bearings, the easiest one to get out by this method first is the one that's flush with the surface on the chain side. So tap that one out first, then spin the wheel over, because the one the other side, on the disc side, that's got the rubber seal on top. So the bearing is down inside a deeper hole, which means it's a little bit more challenging to tap out a bit at a time, side by side, like I just did. So do the flush one first. Then when you've done it, there's nothing in that hole at all, and when you look down there, there's just the bearing. So take a piece of tube, drop that piece of tube down on top of the bearing, and you can just tap it out. Easy. Right, in an attempt to keep this series as generic as possible, rear wheel bearing motorcycle, if you have a look at the hole now that you've got in the cast wheel, you'll find there's a step there. The step that stops the bearing going in too far. So if you've got a step just one side, then you put the bearing in that side first, then you put your spacer tube in, up against the bearing, then you put the other bearing on top of that, and that spacer forms the step for the second bearing because there's nothing either side. Some bikes though, like this one, there's a step both sides, so it doesn't matter which bearing you put in first. So me, I'm going to put the bearing in the flush side first, and I'm going to do it in the most old-fashioned and easy way possible. I'm going to warm it up and tap it in gently with a soft hammer. Right, simple as that. Now, if you put the bearing in the freezer, then you can actually sometimes just push them in with your thumbs or just drop them in. It depends on exactly how much you've heated up the aluminium, but be careful heating it up because obviously it's always going to be powder coated or painted. You don't want to burn that. So if it's too hot to touch, then it's too hot. Hairdryer is perfect, nice and safe. Anyway, there's one more way to put a bearing in without the use of any form of impact whatsoever. You just need a piece of threaded bar, a couple of discs of metal that you've made a hole in, and then you can make a small rudimentary bearing press out of almost nothing. If you're going to make one of these, make sure that the super big discs, the washers that you're going to use, are big enough to press on the outer edge of the bearing, not on the inner edge, obviously. Right, there we are, motorcycle rear wheel bearings, easy as that. The lion's share of the work is taking the wheel out, clearing it up and putting the wheel back in. Actually changing the bearings, about an hour at the most, piece of cake. And you can do it quite easily. You don't need a 20-ton press, you don't need a fancy bridge puller. You can do it with a screwdriver, a hammer and a little press you make yourself out of some bits and bobs. Use your initiative, you can get through. Anyway, I'll leave that there. At this point I would normally put the wheel back in the bike and connect the chain up, but I'm not going to because I'm going to change the chain and sprockets. So join us for the next one and we'll do that. I'll see you then.